Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Cultured Pull List. This is our first episode of spooky season, and so who better to start with than the master of the dark arts himself, John Constantine. We're going to be covering the first volume of his first series, his first solo series, Hellblazer, subtitled Original Sins. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show. As usual, we are your hosts, Mike and Luke. And today we're talking about the first volume of John Constantine Hellblazer. Now, this wasn't his first appearance in the comics. He first showed up in I think it's like a 2 or 3 issue story arc in Swamp Thing. And he basically just showed up and told Swamp Thing like stuff about his powers and that he was an elemental, like that he was more powerful than he thought. And so then soon after that, he had his own series that started, and we actually see at the end of this book, he kind of teams up, or at least has an interaction with Swamp Thing again. But yeah, so let's get into the book. Before we do that, I do want to mention our giveaway that's going through the 31st of this month. It's a hardcover deluxe edition of The Sandman, Book 1. It's a really nice edition. All you have to do to enter is subscribe to the channel and like this episode, as well as commenting with the answer to this week's question, which we will mention the question towards the end of this episode. John Constantine Hellblazer, Volume 1, Original Sins, was written by Jamie Delano and Rick Veitch. The artists were John Ridgway, Alfredo Alcala, Rick Veitch, Tom Mandrake, Brett Ewins, and Jim McCarthy. The colorists are Laverne Kinzierski and Tatiana Wood. The letterers are Annie Halfacre, Todd Klein, and John Costanza. Now, before we start, I do want to mention that this book is kind of a collection of a bunch of different short stories that take place in the comics, like each, like 1 or 2 or even 3 comics are kind of one arc. Though there are some overarching themes, overall they're kind of smaller one-shot stories. Our story opens on a random man having inconsolable urges to just consume more and more and more, to the point where he just starts consuming everything and even tries to eat a person. But even though he's eating so much, he begins to quickly waste away, to the point where he's just a bag of skin and bones. Then we cut to John Constantine himself, arriving home to his apartment, his flat in London, and he sees a heroin needle left on his table, and he assumes it's his friend Gary Lester, who is a drug addict. But he goes to his bathroom and sees Lester there, but he's covered in flies. So John leaves to go to the convenience store, comes back with some bug spray, kills all the bugs, and then has his assistant slash best friend Chaz show up and help him restrain Gary, who's going through withdrawals, so he can get some information out of him, because something's obviously not right with all these bugs. There's something sinister going on. Gary eventually tells him that looking for some drugs, he traveled to Tangier, and while there he found a young boy, and he realized that the young boy was possessed. So he takes the boy to his hotel room and he excises the demon, which unfortunately kills the child, kills the boy, but he is able to trap the demon in a bottle. But the demon preys on addictive nature, so after a while, the demon in the bottle keeps calling to Gary, and he knows he's going to release it if he doesn't get rid of it. So knowing that John Constantine at this time was in New York City, he sends the bottle to New York and then makes his way to crash at John's apartment. in London, but John's there now. So now John knows he needs to figure out the origin of this demon as well as find it in New York City. So John heads to Tangier, and eventually he finds the tribe that the boy came from, and he talks to this shaman who is a part of the tribe, and they're able to communicate. Even though they speak different languages, magic is able to translate for them. And the shaman reveals to John that there was this hunger demon that had been preying on the village people. So in order to get rid of the demon, they decided to let it possess a sacrificial young boy, and then basically just send the boy on his way so that the demon wouldn't attack anybody in their village anymore. And this boy was the one that Gary Lester found. After that, John makes his way to New York City with Gary Lester, and unable to find the bottle that Lester sent him, John tries to enlist the help of Papa Midnight, who is a strong magician slash crime lord in New York City. And Papa Midnight's servants are these undead zombies that John kind of makes quick work of. But John asks for Papa Midnight's help in finding the demon, and also asks if there have been any unexplained phenomena involving hunger. And Papa Midnight says there is, so John figures out that the bottle has been broken somehow and the demon has escaped. So John concocts a plan with Papa Midnight to get rid of this demon, but first John makes his way to an old friend's old apartment. Now, in John's original appearance in the Swamp Thing comics, his friend Emma, who lives in New York, is chased down and killed by a malignant entity, along with several other of John's friends. So John feels very guilty about this, and just in general is still grieving the loss of his friends, Emma in particular. And when he heads to Emma's apartment, inside the apartment building, the ghost of Emma speaks to him and tries to help him. And John and the ghost of Emma start walking around New York City, kind of catching up, I suppose, when they witness somebody affected by the hunger demon just start eating a bunch of raw meat. And they witness firsthand the demon totally ravage the person's body and then leave. So John and Emma's ghost follow the trail of demonic flies to a church, where John sees the demon itself, which he realizes is much too powerful for him to take on his own. So he runs while a priest is left to fend off the demon. And this gives John an idea. So he goes and visits Gary Lester, who is being held at Papa Midnight's compound, so as to not run away and turn to drugs, or even worse, get possessed by the demon. So he visits him and says that they're going to use Gary to get rid of the demon in the morning. So John goes to his hotel room, but he is haunted most of the night by the ghosts of his friends and doesn't get a very good night's sleep. Meanwhile, the hunger demon ravages several people throughout New York City. So the next morning, Papa Midnight sends for John, and they head up to the roof of Papa Midnight's building, where they strap in Gary Lester. And it turns out they're using Gary Lester as bait for a ritual to get rid of the demon. But instead of trapping the demon in a bottle like Gary did, they're planning on trapping the demon in Gary's dying body, who is dying of just drug overuse as well as malnutrition. So the plan is to trap the demon in Gary's body and then let it consume itself inside Gary's body. So that's exactly what happens. John sits outside Gary's cell as he waits for it to happen, drinking himself to sleep as he feels guilt over what he's done to Gary. And as John leaves Papa Midnight's building, he looks across the street and sees the ghosts of his friends, and he sees the ghost of Gary Lester join them. In our next story, we see a wealthy man out for a jog, and he is joined by two other wealthy investors who he apparently owes money to, but with some ungodly power, they're able to make him run so fast that he has a heart attack and dies. Meanwhile, John is visiting his old friend Ray, an older gay man who tells John about a lot of like strange happenings that are going around in the town, mainly just as gossip, but he does mention a jogger who died in melted running shoes, and this piques John's interest, so he goes to the neighborhood that it happens, and he sees the two investors that did what they did to this man, and he looks inside the window of their home, and it turns out that they are demons in disguise. And meanwhile, we see a cut to a corner of hell where this demon, Blethoxy, is taking bids on souls. There's basically like this whole stock market going on down in hell, but with people's souls instead of money. Pretty interesting. So John then follows this demon couple to a club, and he learns pretty quickly that this is actually a club for demons who are selling people's souls and trading them and buying them like stocks. And once he figures that he's stumbled into a demon's den, he books out of there pretty quick, and even though they chase after him, he gets away. Then John performs a ritual to meet with Blethoxy, to try and sell his soul himself. It's not 100% clear, but he's definitely trying to trick him, but Blethoxy doesn't fall for it, and they kick him out of hell, and the demons that have followed him actually capture John and string him up. But right as they're about to kill him, Blethoxy shows up and says that John somehow tanked the market. It's not really clear. Either I missed that detail or it's not really clear, but apparently John outsmarted him and tanked the stock market, the soul stock market, and they basically leave John to his devices and go back to hell. So in the next story, we see a young girl pining for her old neighborhood. Apparently her parents joined some religious group called the Resurrection Crusaders, and they made them move to a different neighborhood, so she's missing her old home and her old friends. Then we see John walking around London, and he stumbles upon this young woman named Zed, and the two hit it off and end up going out on a date. Then we cut back to the girl, who was joined by 3 other girls at the local park, and they talk to her about this man that they're married to, and they convince the girl to follow them to be married by the man himself. It's kind of weird, but it seems like they have some sort of weird control over her desires. So they take the girl to the man's house, and they say they have to wait for him to come back. After their date, John goes back to Zed's apartment where the TV is on, and John hears about a young girl named Gemma Masters who has failed to return. She's returned to her home. She's missing, and it turns out that this girl is John's sister's daughter, his niece. So John rushes over to his sister's house, where his sister's in hysterics, and some men from the Resurrection Army are there, kind of lending a hand, but not really doing a whole lot. Trying to suggest that the girl was that her sin is what caused her to be kidnapped. So then we see Gemma back at this random man's house, and the girls give her a wedding dress that she'll need to get married in, obviously. So then we see John and Zed looking for clues in Gemma's room, and they're able to use magic to divine where Gemma is, or at least the general area. Meanwhile, the man returns home and sees Gemma in the wedding dress and decides, yes, he will marry her. So John and Zed are able to find the man's house, and inside they come across the discovery that the 3 girls are actually dead. They're corpses, and Gemma had been talking to their ghosts. and they're able to stop the man just as he's about to kill Gemma in some twisted wedding ceremony. But before they leave, John and Zed see that a mark of the Damnation Army is inscribed on the man's chest. So the night ends with John going back to Zed's again, and yeah, they have some sexy time. In the next story, we see some flashback to Vietnam. It's not really clear who this is about. And we see this small town in Iowa, and it's said through narration that the town had been convinced by the Resurrection Army that we saw in the last issue, to pray for the young men that they lost in Vietnam to come back to them, which apparently works, but not in the way they intended. The ghosts do come back, but they still think they're in war, and they end up killing this one old guy in his field. So then we see John. He's in the States to see Swamp Thing, but he stops off at this small town, and he meets this lady who is married to the only young man in the town who had survived Vietnam. And then we see more like kind of flashbacks, but really the ghosts like revisiting. Like all they see is Vietnam, even though they're going around the town. And for some reason, it's not really explained too much, but the prayers of the people in the Resurrection Army have somehow kind of caused this to happen, and it even causes the surviving man in the town to join the ghosts of his fallen comrades. And what ends up happening is they just go into the town and just basically kill everyone and commit basically all the horrible crimes that they committed in Vietnam, which is kind of disturbing. And John barely escapes with his life. He ends up hiding in the field and just kind of watches while everything happens helplessly. And finally it ends with the ghosts, the ghosts and the one living soldier shooting a tanker truck, which just kind of blows up most of the town. And John ends up leaving the town with a renewed perspective on the Vietnam War, even seeing some advertised war movies and realizing how unrealistic they probably are. And he ends up leaving the town rightfully disturbed. In the next issue, we see this group of neo-Nazis that try to kill what they think is a gay homeless man, but it turns out, I don't know why they thought he was gay, but they do. It turns out it's actually a demon named Nurgle, and he kills them all. And with their blood, he writes Damnation Army on the ceiling. John goes into the building after them to make sure they don't rough up the man they were intending to, not knowing it was a demon, and he sees the aftermath and sees the Damnation Army on the ceiling. So next, John calls some connections he has, an investigative journalist, and he can't seem to get any solid information on this Damnation Army, despite his best efforts. So he ends up going back to Zed's apartment, where Zed is being confronted by more of a enforcer group of the Resurrection Army called the Tongues of Fire, I believe. And they are trying to get Zed to come back to them. Apparently she was a part of the Resurrection. I've been saying Resurrection Army a lot. I mean Resurrection Crusaders. Zed was apparently part of the Resurrection Crusaders, and she and John kind of have an argument about it because she doesn't seem to want to tell John about it, but they end up reconciling. But next we see Nurgle in his underground lair with a bunch of people he's demonized, I guess. And it turns out he's the leader of this Damnation Army that John's been seeing all around London. And he takes the bodies of the neo-Nazis and turns them into some weird messed up monster and sends them after Zed. So this neo-Nazi monstrosity comes after Zed and Constantine, but Constantine is able to outsmart it and basically turn them against each other based off of their pettiness, because in life they rooted for different football clubs. So he's able to turn them against each other with that, and they end up killing each other. So John takes Zed to Ray's house to take care of her, and he leaves Zed with Ray. And Ray reveals to Constantine that he has AIDS, which is obviously very upsetting, and John tries to comfort him. But John then stays with Ray for a while as well, but he ends up getting a call from Nurgle, who basically warns him that not to get in the way of him or his damnation army anymore. So in the next issue, John goes to his old friend Richie Simpson, who is able to combine magic and technology in a really interesting way. He's basically able to go into the internet via magic. So that's what he does to find more information on the Resurrection Crusaders and the Damnation Army. And what he ends up finding is the Resurrection Crusaders have a main base in Glastonbury, but due to some like protective magic spells, Richie's body is burned up while Richie is inside the computer still. And being trapped inside the computer, John ends up pulling the plug to spare Richie from either just being trapped in the internet or returning to a dead body. While this is going on, Zed and Ray kind of bond a little bit, and Ray explains that he was in love with a soldier. Well, he was in love with a man who was a soldier, and the man went and died in Falklands War. And it seems like Ray hasn't been with anybody since then. Well, at least, not anything long term. But the tongues of fire, but while they're talking, the tongues of fire show up to kidnap Zed, and they end up beating and killing Ray in the process. And here's Constantine pulling the plug on Richie's computer. So Constantine jumps on a train to go to Glastonbury, but on the way there, he ends up being haunted by the ghosts of his friends, who basically torment him and tell him how much he messed up and failed them. So, in an act of desperation, John jumps out of the moving train, kind of forgetting that he's on a very fast-moving train. So, next thing we see is the Resurrection Crusaders base in Glastonbury, where Zed has been basically brainwashed and turned into who they keep calling the Mary for their cause. Apparently that was like what she was intended to be initially before she left, but now she's back and she's now brainwashed back into the cause through mainly surgery, seems like. So yeah, that's fun. And we also see John having this nightmare that he's being imprisoned and tortured. And when he awakes from his nightmare, he is in intensive care in a hospital from jumping out of the moving train. It turns out that Swamp Thing found him and took him to the hospital. And while John's laying there, a doctor enters. But it turns out it's not a doctor, it's a Nurgle, the demon. And Nurgle says that he wants to recruit John to basically thwart the Resurrection Crusaders' plan, which seemingly is to use Zed, who is their quote-unquote Mary, to birth a new messiah, basically, and destroy the forces of hell. That seems to be their plan, and he wants John to put a stop to that, to stop Zed from being their Mary, and he refuses, of course, but Nurgle threatens to kill a bunch of the babies in the ward, the maternity ward in the hospital, if John doesn't comply, so John agrees to serve him to spare the babies' lives. And Nurgle heals John by basically putting a bit of his essence inside John, so John kind of has some demonic force inside him. So after John leaves the hospital, he kind of runs for a while, kind of running from what he has to do. So he goes to Gotham City and just kind of feels sorry for himself for a while, being haunted by his friend's ghosts yet again, until finally he comes face to face with, seems like a version of himself, which convinces him to get his act together, basically. So John then flies back to England and goes to Glastonbury, where he meets up with Zed. He tries to convince her to leave the Resurrection Crusaders, but she refuses. But, they end up sleeping together, which foils their plan because while they do the deed, John ends up transferring, not really on purpose, but he knows it's going to happen, transferring some of that demonic energy that's inside him to Mary, which kind of makes her an unqualified candidate to be the Mary. So, yeah, that's what happens. And he doesn't feel good about it, but, you know, he does it anyway. So when John gets home, Swamp Thing spawns in his apartment through his pack of cigarettes and ends up possessing John's body for a plan he and Swamp Thing's wife have planned. Meanwhile, the Phantom Stranger and Etrigan the Demon kind of just sit around watching this happen, knowing what Swamp Thing has planned. And these issues of Swamp Thing, there's a lot of stuff built on past Swamp Thing issues, so I'm really just gonna breeze through like what the continuation, like what the main theme is and what the continuation of John's story is in all this. But we see Abby Arcane, who's Alec Collins' ex-wife, who is kind of Swamp Thing, but she ended up marrying Matt Cable, who was in a coma because he crashed his car and he's basically on death's door. She's trying to kind of get permission from him to go back to Alec, who is now Swamp Thing, and she feels like she gets that closure. So Swamp Thing in John's body travels into the Louisiana Bayou, the swamp, and he and Abby meet in the swamp, and their plan is to basically make a baby, basically, who's going to be like the future of the Guardians of the Green, I guess, or the Elementals. So that's their fun plan. So they get down and dirty and do their thing, and yeah, that's that one issue. Then the next issue, Abby seems to be having second thoughts about being with Swamp Thing, I guess because he's a Swamp Thing. So she ends up going into the city. She gets some money from her friends and goes into the nearest town, where she meets John Constantine, who I guess is still there after having his body be used for nuptials. And he and Abby, even though Abby doesn't really like Constantine that much as a person, they still end up hanging out and having a fun time together, and he kind of looks after her. And they spend the night together, but like not really, that they just share a hotel room. And after she kind of gets this out of her system, she realizes that she wants to be with Alex / Swamp Thing, so she has Constantine take her back to the swamp, where Swamp Thing had made basically a bunch of like swamp versions of different people that he could just kind of hit and smash, including there's like a Superman and a Constantine and a Batman. It's kind of funny. But Swamp Thing, Alec, and Abby are reunited, and Abby says bye and thanks to John, and that's where this book wraps up. Luke, what did you think of this book?
I really enjoyed it. It was there was a kind of a bit of a overarching thing, but most of it was very standalone, and I almost felt like I honestly wasn't paying attention, but it almost feels like some of it's written by a different person. That might not be the case, but that's kind of how it feels like, because like the first two were two-part story, and it was sort of pretty straightforward. Some good horror imagery in there. But the second story, which is the third issue, it was sort of this weird, like a political satire almost. Like it was kind of like making fun of the British economic situation when it was in the 80s when it was published, and it was like very comedic, especially when compared to the earlier stuff. I still enjoyed it, but it felt very different. And then I think my favorite one was probably the one with the dead kids. I really liked that.
Okay.
A lot of
I was gonna ask you. Yeah, I was gonna ask you because it is sort of episodical. Yeah. In a lot of ways. So it looks like there are two writers, though I think the second one might have been for the Swamp Thing issues. Okay. I'm not 100% sure, but Yeah, it was a lot more political than I
Yeah.
expected. Like not just in that one, but they cover a lot of topics, like
Hmm.
the economic just kind of dishevel upheaval in Britain at the time, and also like gay issues, gay right kind of
Yeah.
things, and even some just some religious stuff, which is like I expected the religious stuff, because the
Hmm.
religious commentary, because it's Constantine, that kind of happens a lot, but there was also some um discussion, and I guess some imagery, whatever you want to call it, on the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
There were just a lot of issues of the day that they did not shy away from
Right.
um
Yeah.
tackling, which I thought was interesting.
Hmm.
Which it is kind of funny too when people say like, "Why are comics so political now?" Like they've been political for a while,
Right. Right.
but they just aren't always the ones that are in the spotlight, I guess.
Yeah, because I mean, I
But
don't know like how popular this was, but like this is
mhm,
it's very open about what it's trying to
yeah,
say. And I mean, I
yeah.
wasn't alive at the time, but looking back, it's kind of admirable.
Yeah, and that is kind of interesting. An interesting aspect of Constantine's character is he's he's kind of weirdly like he's hard to pin down,
Mhm.
um, moral wise, because he's kind of a wild card in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
but he does seem to kind of have a certain code of ethics, in a way, and he's kind of political and in all like a border. He's not. I wouldn't say he's an anarchist, but he's kind of like on the edge,
Right.
of that kind of mindset. It's kind of an interesting character. But what was this, like the first Constantine comics or Hellblazer comics you've read?
Yeah. Everything I knew about the character was kind of from the Arrowverse, and then
Okay.
whatever crossovers he's popped up in. But this is the first like Constantine standalone stuff I've read.
Okay. Yeah, my next question was going to be your introduction to the character. So for me, I think I had heard about him a little bit, but my first big introduction was the series that came out in like 2014 or
Mhm.
whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and then I don't think I saw the Keanu Reeves movie until later, but that's like not true to the comics like much at
Mhm.
all. And then yeah, like the Arrowverse stuff, and then like he's been in a lot of animated stuff recently.
Yeah.
Um, and like it is kind of interesting. Like Matt Ryan plays him, the guy who played him he first started playing Constantine in the series,
Hmm.
and then he started voicing him in a lot of animated stuff and playing him in like the Arrowverse shows.
Yeah.
And I feel like his role is a bit unique, 'cause you don't see that many people playing the same character in that many different
Hmm.
forms of media and whatnot. So it's kind of interesting. But I think I started reading this like a while ago, around the time that the live action series came out.
Hmm.
So I think I read the first issue or two of this, but that's it. I didn't finish it. So this is the first time I'd read some standalone Constantine comics, I believe. Though I've read like Justice League Dark and other
Okay.
stuff
Yeah.
he's appeared in. But so yeah, this was definitely interesting. It was actually. I mean, I was expecting, kind of a horror,
Hmm.
occult vibe, but I think sometimes it surprised me with how like horror it really was.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think the way that it presents the horror is also interesting because I was not expecting it to be like we mentioned earlier, like, oh, this is
mhm.
the Vietnam War, this is
Yeah,
like politics or whatever. I guess what makes it more the imagery more powerful is just what it like
yeah.
represents, I guess.
Yeah, I think the most upsetting one was probably the Vietnam one, because there wasn't much of a point to it besides
Right.
how like messed up everything was. Like John didn't like step in and save the day. He just sort of like was a bystander in that story.
Yeah, he doesn't really do anything. He's just kind of there observing it as it happens.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. Which I think was pretty unique for the book too,
Hmm.
because in every other story he had more of an active role.
Right.
But it's pretty clear early on that he's not your typical hero.
Hmm.
Like he does want to, he does kind of have a greater good in his mind, but he does a lot of kind of messed up and
Yeah.
backhanded stuff, especially to his friends. But that's kind of like the whole point. And then like, you know, he's really haunted by them and the things that have happened to his friends, and he feels responsible for most of it. Which I mean, it kind of starts with, like, they don't go into too much detail in the book, but like the over, like, kind of like his origin was like he and his friends like started a band when they were like pretty young, like teenagers or early 20s, and they kind of dabbled in the occult just like kind of as a hobby, I guess. And they went to one gig where this guy, the owner of the venue, had a daughter who was possessed by a demon. And he asked them to excise the demon, but they couldn't really do it because it was too powerful. So John had the idea to summon a different demon to fight that demon. And like it worked, but then the demon they summoned ended up dragging the girl to hell. And that was kind of like their kind of like initial moment that kind of sent them on their paths. So whenever, like, 'cause there were a couple times in this book where he mentions the Newcastle crew.
Okay.
That was like that was like all his friends that were present during that thing, that were like part of the band, or, you know, just kind of like there during that event. And all of them were pretty traumatized, and none of them were kind of the same after it. You know, like that one friend turned to drugs and all that. So
yeah.
And that demon Nurgle who's in the book is actually that demon that he's the head of like the damnation army or whatever in the book we read.
Yeah, the one in the hospital.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's actually the one that dragged that girl to hell and everything that Constantine summoned, though it doesn't seem like Constantine knows that at the point that we read, because he doesn't really make any mention of it, but at some point they do make that canon.
Okay.
But yeah, I found that really interesting. I think to me the weirdest story was probably the end one, where Swamp Thing like possessed John's body and was like, "Oh, let's go make a kid, honey," you know. Like that was kind of odd. But I guess originally those last two issues, the Swamp Thing issues, weren't included.
Okay.
In the collection, so I guess it just ended with Swamp Thing like showing up, and then that's it. So I kind of get why they, even though they didn't really lead to anywhere, I get why they included them, because they led right into that crossover.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if I had to choose one of the stories, it was probably one of the like Resurrection Army, whatever the hell they were, ones. Maybe the first one, which I think was the little girl one, either that one or the one where he like the really political one where he tried to sell his soul to that one demon, but I forget what he did to mess with them.
I don't know, because he like tried to sell his soul, but then for somehow that like crashed the market, so then the British soul was worthless or whatever.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what he did, because I think it was more than that, but now I can't remember.
Right, because there was like the rich like socialite people were literally demons who were like moving into the neighborhood.
Yeah,
I don't remember.
And in that one scene where they were chanting like Thatcher when he was getting re-elected, like Maggie Thatcher.
Very on the nose.
Yes, very. Yeah, but it was kind of funny.
Right.
I don't know, I just kind of enjoy the kind of like, it is very much like a detective story. Yeah. Like a detective series, even though it's very, you know, paranormal and occult. He's pretty much a paranormal detective, which is kind of interesting.
Right.
He kind of feels like a twist on like the archetype, like private detective, you know?
Yeah.
And I gotta say, I really like the art style. I remember when I think it works really well with the horror and just like the eeriness that it's trying to invoke. When I was younger and I tried to read this, I really didn't like the art style. I just didn't really get it, you know. I was like, why isn't this more true to life or whatever, you know? But going back and reading it now, I do really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, it's just a really good collection of stories that they're all, like we mentioned, it's all very episodic. But yeah, it's a good book.
Before we go to our cultured picks, let us know in the comments. The question of the week is going to be which of these Constantine stories is your favorite, or if you have a different Constantine comic or story or something that is your favorite, let us know down in the comments. And now let's go to our cultured picks. What do you have for this week?
This week, my pick is Army of Darkness Forever, I believe it's called, #1. The movie Army of Darkness, there's actually two endings to it. The more popular ending is the one where he shoots the demon in the grocery store. He goes back to his regular time. But the original ending, he sleeps for another 100 years and he wakes up in 2093. And so yeah, so this book, it kind of goes off of that, the second timeline technically, but while also having continuing in the present day 1993 timeline as well, because there's like two Ashes. One of them's the evil Ash, one of them's the real Ash, and so yeah, there's not a lot that happens in this book. It's just kind of setting up that concept, but yeah, it's cool.
So my pick for this week is the Superior Spider-Man Returns. Yeah. It's kind of a one-shot. It's basically setting up a new Superior Spider-Man series. But it basically goes back to the time when Dr. Octopus was Spider-Man, in Spider-Man's body. And he's remembering things that he can't remember now that Dr. Octopus himself is back. And it's kind of just going back and like filling in some of the blanks that even the original Superior Spider-Man series didn't really touch on. Like, at some point in the comics, he just sort of changes suits, whereas this actually like has like a reason for where he came up with that suit and everything. But it's also setting up a really powerful villain that they're definitely like retconning and making that character tie to Dr. Octopus or Superior Spider-Man's backstory. But I think the biggest strength with this book is just that it feels very much like the original Superior Spider-Man series. It's been like 10 years since that, and it was just kind of fun seeing Dr. Octopus, back as Spider-Man, because he basically talks and acts like Dr. Octopus, but as Spider-Man. So just that kind of dynamic and having him interact with other people, especially people who know Spider-Man, is kind of fun. So I thought that was interesting. It was a pretty cool book, and I'm definitely going to check out, because I have I think the complete Superior Spider-Man series. I collected them as they came out, so I'm definitely going to check out the new series. But yeah, this one shot was pretty cool.
Yeah, I picked it up. I haven't read it yet, but I have it.
But yeah, that is this. Well, I guess kind of this week's episode, since this is coming out late. We're gonna have 2 come out this week, so this is coming out more in the middle of the week, and then we're gonna have our regular episode coming out this weekend, which is gonna be the Sandman Volume 1, which is what we're giving away in the giveaway. So yeah, definitely keep your eyes peeled for that, coming out in a few days. This has been TCN Presents The Cultured Pull List. If you would like to support us on Patreon to help us bring you more content, check us out at patreon.com/theculturednerd, and look for our show specific tier if you would like to support our show specifically. I have been your host, Michael Malillo. My co-host has been Luke S. Our logo was designed by Jose Navarro, and our intro was designed by me. Thank you so much for joining us. Please like and subscribe, that really helps a lot. Scan the QR code on the bottom left to check out The Cultured Nerd on social media, and scan the QR code on the bottom right to check out me and Luke's other brand, Casual Experts, on social media, YouTube, and our other podcast. Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you next time.